Hello, everyone, and welcome. As people join, we're going to get started because it is the top of the hour. Welcome to the art and a little bit of science of the training experience debrief. My name is Tim Waxenfelder. I am the co-founder of Endurance Learning, and you'll see me a little bit today as your producer. Endurance Learning is a full service training development company. Since 2015, our team has delivered best-in-class e-learning, instructor-led training, train-the-trainer services, and a whole host of other L&D-related services to all sorts of organizations. On your screen right now is a QR code. I encourage you to use that to connect with us on LinkedIn. We love having these connections, having you in our community, whether it's in these webinars as providing a service to you or on LinkedIn. So as we get going, I'll remind you that you should not leave when we say thank you at the end of the webinar. We'll say thank you, and that's when we'll stop the recording. But right after that, we have a couple of things that we want to do. We want to do free giveaways. So we've got a couple of different things. We've got 2 books by your host, who I will introduce in a moment. The first one is one of 2 books, Instructional Design on a Shoestring, or What's Your Formula? 2 books that have been incredibly successful. A lot of people talk about as core parts of their instructional design library. We'll also have a drawing for one of our courses. So we have a couple of different courses that a lot of people find really valuable to build up their basic skills. If it's too basic for your skill level, we can always talk about handing it off to somebody in your organization that needs more support. So many of you have been with us for a very long time. Brian and I discovered today that this is our 13th monthly webinar in a row. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. Maybe you're somebody who signed on with us, many months ago and has come to multiple webinars. Maybe you're brand new. But for us, it's exciting to do these every month. A big part of it is creating a learning and development community. We love connecting with people, learning more about which work you're doing. Every webinar, we learn something new. We teach, but we're also learning at the same time. It's a core part of our beliefs that we believe in sharing our expertise, but they're also something else. So up here, you can see on the screen some examples of some sessions we deliver. The free webinars, we make them as engaging and interactive as possible. I think everyone who's been on one would know that already. Because we often have breakout rooms, we have practical activities, but our training sessions that we deliver to organizations are even better because they're longer than an hour. They're designed around your needs. We can stack several topics together if you need beginner, if you need more advanced. We have all of that, and every month we deliver sessions like this to organizations. They're very affordable. We can deliver them virtually. We can also do in person. So reach out to us and let us know if it's something that is valuable to you. Speaking of webinars, I guess number 14th webinar will be next month, and we would encourage you to sign up for that. You can use the QR code. Our colleague Rachel will also put the link to it in the chat. It's scenario-based instructor-led training using branching and role play to develop better decision makers. This is going to be a really exciting topic. We can't wait to dive into this. So definitely sign up for that. You'll see lots of reminders from us as well. I'm really excited. I see a lot of people from all over the place. I think I just saw something about somebody that went to high school with Brian. So that's really fun because maybe we'll get some good gossip about what he was like in high school. But in addition to putting about where you're from today, we would like to ask another question in the chat. We have a lot more topics to come. We have a lot of ideas, but we would love to hear from you. What's something that you're interested in us presenting? But also remember, it doesn't have to be something that we are experts in. It could be something that we have a colleague or a partner. We have a lot of partners who've asked us to be on our monthly webinars because of the number of people that attend and because of how amazing they think all of you are and they want to reach you. So if there's a topic that you're interested in, even from Leeds, England, please share that in the chat. We would love to hear that from you. So let's get going because you want to get started. I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Many of you already know him, but I will still give you a little background. Brian has been in the learning and development field for over 20 years, well over 20 years. Um, Most of his time before working at Endurance Learning was spent leading training teams in the nonprofit sector, working for several different organizations, growing their national training efforts. As I mentioned earlier, he's published two books that a lot of people will say are indispensable to them. If you have one of these books and it's valuable to you, chat in the comments. Tell us why it's valuable to you. A little fun fact about Brian. Brian is, for the first time in over 15 years, excited to watch Buffalo Sabres hockey because they have clinched the playoffs and he can't stop thinking about it. So with that, I want to welcome in today's host, Brian Washburn.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, indeed. Go Sabres. I'm very excited for the first time in 15 years. We were back in the playoffs. And if anybody wants to nerd out with me over Sabres hockey, Buffalo Bills football, or anything of the great state of New York, especially Western New York, I'm happy to do that. My QR code to my LinkedIn profile is right there as well. That said, that's not why you're here. We're here to talk a little bit about debriefing today. And when it comes to debriefing, I'm just going to share a little bit about kind of what we're going to walk through today during today's session. First of all, if we're going to talk about debriefing, let's use that term in the same way so that you may have different ways that you define debriefing outside of this webinar. But for today, for the purposes of today's session, one of the things that I want to make sure that we do is we use this word in the same way, so that we can have a productive conversation around it. And then the other thing we're going to do, well, not the other thing, but another thing we're going to do today is talk about what do the studies say? Like, why is debriefing important? And are there some techniques that we should be using? We're also going to be talking about putting debriefing into some different categories. Not all debriefing is the same. So we're going to talk about the intent of our training and maybe some of the things that we might want to do or ask based on the intent or outcomes that we're hoping from the training session. You all are going to get into small groups at one point during today's webinar where you're going to be able to make some nominations for the debriefing awards, and I'll talk about that as we get going here. And then the final thing is that we'll talk also about not just about the questions that we might want to be asking, but how do we structure the debrief? What are some different strategies that we can use in order to get from our learners what it is that we're looking for to show that they are actually able to achieve some of the learning outcomes? All of that said, I do want to put a warning label on here because one of the things that participants have suggested in the past is that they weren't expecting breakout rooms in a giant public webinar. And so expect it. It's coming. And we hope that you'll stick around for those breakout discussions. I know that some people sometimes will depart a webinar if there is a breakout room. For the folks that have stayed, and Tim has mentioned we've done this. This is the 13th webinar in a row that we've done monthly webinars. Some people say that that is the most powerful, or where the biggest learning ahas come from is when they can talk with other people in a small group setting that are going through some of the same things that they're going through. So that is a little bit of an overview for today's session, but let's jump into debriefing itself and beginning with a definition here. So the definition that I'm going to use when I'm talking about debriefing today is this is a structured, facilitated process that follows an activity or a simulation or an experience to help learners extract meaning and plan for real-world application. And the important part here is that structured piece. What we want to do is we don't want to just kind of have some Q&A at the end of an activity and call that our debrief. We want to have some intent. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about what kinds of things we can ask. But the first question that I have for you, and we'll go over to the chat for this question, is why do we debrief? I would love to hear some. We have over 100 people who are here who are sharing some of the things that. Some of the places that you're from, some of the things that you'd like to see in terms of future webinars. But for today's webinar, you're here for debriefing. My question is, why do we debrief? Go ahead and take a look at some of the answers that are coming in on the chat. So to help us, I love that one, to help us retain the information provided, turn the experience into insight. Oh, Sarah's asking Rachel if you can pull that definition off and put it into the chat here as well. Connect learning to real work to help give everyone a shared understandings. Okay, so to action plan forward. There's lots of different thoughts. I love all of these thoughts. Aaron says because reflection on learning content is where the learning comes from, not from the consumption or exposure to the content. And there is actually some research behind. So some of the things that you're putting in here into the chat, there's some research that supports the why do we debrief. So let's actually, this whole webinar is called The Art and a Little Science Behind the Training Experience Debrief. Let's take a look at that science. And when it comes to the science behind the importance of the training debrief, there is a lot of what you were writing here. You may or may not have taken a look at these studies. It maybe it was just kind of something that through your practice you have found the value in debriefs. But let me give you a little bit of information from several studies that I took a look at in preparation for today's webinar. And the first one goes all the way back to 1978. For those of you who are around, and I was certainly around, I was about 2 or 3 at the time, there was a study focused on the generation effect. And this, when they talk about the generation effect, they're not talking about baby boomers or Generation X, which is the best generation, by the way, or millennials or other folks. They're talking about generating actual content for yourself. Now, in this study, what they found was that learners can better remember words and ideas that they themselves come up with. This is something that actually I was kind of first exposed to this concept through the Bob Pike group, and they do some great training and train the trainer programs as well. But when we take a look at this study, what it basically, or basically how they did this study was they asked people, some people in the study, to come up with an antonym for a word like cold, hot, right? So people came up with their own words. And then there's a control group that was just given a list of words to remember. And then basically when they kind of took a look at the results of the study, asking people to remember what words that they experienced during that experience, people who actually came up with the words themselves were able to remember those words better than people who just read something on a paper. Now, for me, what this tells me is that when it comes to post-training activity experiences, it is a lot better for us to be able to ask some intentional questions to help people process what they learned and articulate what they learned using their own words than it is for us to say, we're running short on time. We just finished that activity. I want to make sure that you know exactly the intent of that activity. What we did that activity for was X, Y, and Z purposes. When we can get learners to share their own thoughts or words, they're able to remember that better. Let me bring you fast forward. Let's fast forward a few decades to 2005, and we'll take a look at another study. And this study was actually done around medical simulations. And so what they found in this study was that educational feedback, also known as debriefing, was the most important factor in medical education. Now, this particular study wasn't just taking a look at one group, an experiment group and a control group. This study was a meta-analysis of a number of different studies. And what the researchers found was that debriefing a simulation or an experience in medical education was the single most important component to a learning experience. It was more important than having people do the same task over and over until they got it right. It was more important than including a range of task difficulty, so going from easy to hard. Debriefing was more important than incorporating a bunch of different learning strategies into the instruction. And debriefing was even more important than individualized learning. So that is a pretty strong case for why it's really important not for the debrief to be an afterthought. Oh, we just did an activity. Let me quick think of a question that I can ask the group. Debriefing is something that's really important to be intentional about. And then let's take a look at the third study. And this was another meta-analysis around the role of reflection in individual learning. And there are kind of three conclusions that came out of this particular study. The people who did this research basically came to the conclusion that learning by thinking is actually more important than learning by doing. I want to repeat that. Learning by thinking is much more important than learning by doing. I also want to give an asterisk to this because if you have the choice between learning by doing and learning by listening, let's do learning by doing. But that's only half the battle. We also need to think about how do we get people to reflect on and think about the experience they just had. And so when it came to this particular study, they found that participants who reflected on their experience, they showed a statistically significant higher improvement in their accuracy to do a task compared to a group that just practiced without actual reflection. Another conclusion was that merely doing a task repeatedly, meaning giving people more experience with that task in a practice setting, didn't automatically lead to learning or improved performance. That's kind of the definition of insanity, right? Have somebody do the same thing over and over and over again without any sort of reflection or learning. And then finally, reflection boosted a person's confidence in their ability to do a task. So those are pretty important pieces. That confidence piece is really important, especially if we want people to take this task or take what we taught somebody and use it when they go into the actual real world setting. So we just talked about a lot of the chat involved. You all actually have lots of good reasons why we debrief. And I just wanted to share just a few studies, and there's a lot of studies out there around the importance of debriefing. Now the question becomes, great, everybody's on board. We have 122 people on this webinar. Probably everybody, I'm guessing, I'm hoping, is on board with the importance of debriefing. But then the question becomes, how do we do it? Right? So it's one thing to say, yeah, we should do it. It's another thing to say, how do we do it? And in its most basic form, debriefing involves asking the right questions. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at a tale of two different debrief questions. I'm going to put two questions up here on the screen, and I want you to think about what is the difference in kind of the learner experience that might happen if you were to ask one question compared to the other. So one very common question that I will see or experience when I'm attending a training at a conference session or something like that is any questions? That does give me an opportunity to think and see if I have any questions. Very rarely do I see lots of questions being asked, and it's not very targeted. Versus, what was the most uncomfortable truth you had to face during your small group discussion? So, just real quick in the chat, what do you think is the difference between the question on the left and the question on the right? Like how does the question on the left impact the learning experience versus how does the question on the right impact the learning experience? Jennifer says no one wants to be the one who asks questions, especially if it's right before lunch or at the end of the day. Yes, we're putting the onus on the learner to come up with something, right? The left is closed, the right is open. There's certainly something to be said there as well. I love that idea and the reminder that really good debrief questions oftentimes are open-ended questions. They can't simply be answered by one or two words, a yes or a no, or maybe, or I think so, right? So open-ended questions oftentimes will require a deeper level of learning. No right or wrong answer to the question on the right. Absolutely. So the question on the left, there's no right or wrong answer, but a lot of times there's no questions. And somebody just kind of moves on, and any of the key learning points that we had, we've missed that opportunity now. The right requires you to actually think about what you learned, and that's where we want to get to when we talk about debrief questions. And so, sometimes one of the trickiest thing I know that when I'm designing a training program is to figure out, well, what's the right question to ask? I know that I should ask a question here. What's the right question? And so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share, or my colleague Rachel is going to put a link into the chat that has more than 50 different debrief questions, and they're broken down by different types of intent for your training. And we'll talk about what I mean by different types of intent for our training. But I want to make sure that you have this document. And if you can, go ahead and open it up because we're going to be focusing on this document for a little bit of time here during this discussion, during this webinar. And so really the questions we choose really do depend on our intent. And so let me break down training in a very broad sense into four buckets. I know there's going to be more buckets than this, but just for the time that we have, and just to kind of give you a general overview of maybe what some of the potential buckets for our intent for training could be, I'm going to break it down just into four different categories here. So the first would be training that revolves around general awareness, right? We don't necessarily need people to do something tomorrow. Maybe we're announcing a new policy. Maybe we're announcing a change in what we're doing. Maybe we're letting people know, this has kind of been our performance. These are some numbers from last quarter, whatever it might be, right? So we have general awareness. It doesn't mean that we don't want people to remember some of the things that we're teaching them during general awareness types of training. When we do a general awareness type of training, the focus of our questions should be on the perspective shift and how the new information changes a worldview, or perhaps how they view their role or their organization, things like that. So let me pause here. For those who are able to download and then open up that document, there's a list of questions about general awareness. I'm wondering, are there any questions in there that jump out at you like that? Like what would be a question that you're like, that's an interesting question to ask based on just kind of a general awareness training? Oh, I'm seeing representation from the Association for Talent Development Puget Sound chapter with both Aaron and Jordan jumping into the chat. Thank you, ATDPS. Love it. What part of today's session felt like it was written specifically for your desk? Yeah, I think there's such power in a very targeted, intentional question, even when we're training people on some general types of topics. How does this information change the way you view yes, thank you for taking a look at some of these questions. There's a lot of questions here. We're going to do an activity in small groups in a little bit where you're going to actually take a look and you're going to use these questions. And so I just want to get you familiar with some of these questions on the different category. Yes, and this is not a be all and end all exhaustive list of questions. And so if you have other questions, or maybe if you don't see quite the exact one on this list, you can feel free to add your own questions as well. Let me move on to the next bucket of training intent, and that could be technical skills. And so when we talk about technical skills, those are hard skills. They could be related to IT or computer systems. Technical skills could be if we're in the medical community and we're learning a specific procedure, steps to a process, things like that, right? So when we talk about technical skills, we want the debrief to focus on precision and accuracy, regardless of what kind of industry we're in. That should be the focus of those technical skills. Go ahead and I like Jordan. I like your comment. I want to be able to like and heart some of the questions in this chat. You're actually gonna have a chance to nominate some of these questions for awards in just a minute. But when it comes to technical skills and the list of questions in the technical skills, are there any of those questions that jump out at you as you're kind of perusing those questions? I'm gonna take a pause here and just kind of see. How does a mistake at the beginning of the process snowball? by the end, which I think, again, we have a more Seattle representation from the chat. I love this. I'm kind of wondering where my Western New York people are, though. If you are from Western New York, make sure you end all of your chat responses with Go Sabres. If you had to do this 100 times a day, what part of the technique would make you automate the first? I I love the questions that are starting to jump out at you, and you're going to have obviously you've had seconds to process these questions, and there's just a list here that is just fertile for you to be able to think through. These are great questions, not quite the ones that I would ask. I might change it to ask this, or maybe this particular question is not something I would ask, but it sparks an idea to ask this other question. Let me take you through two more kind of buckets of training, and then we're going to kind of play around and have a little bit of a conversation in small groups about these questions. The next one is around leadership development. So leadership development, and here we're not necessarily only talking about training programs for people at a certain point in the organization. So by title, leadership for any time I've been introduced to leadership development as being able to develop skills regardless of your role in the organization so that you can influence others and mobilize resources to accomplish a goal. When we're doing leadership development type of work, the intent that we want for the debrief is to focus on how that leader's behavior impacts others' motivation or trust or results. And then another bucket, and there's lots of questions there for you to kind of think about as well. I'm gonna kind of go into this next bucket, and then you're gonna have a chance with small groups to kind of think through all of these questions. The final bucket that I'm gonna put kind of training intent into, and I know there's lots of other reasons that you might do training for people who are in the early learning space. There could be a session on learning how to or teaching staff on how to wash their hands might not fit into a lot of these categories. But for the purposes of this time, what we want to do is we want to just kind of focus on just kind of some buckets of training. So safety and quality and compliance. The focus there when you're doing a debrief is to focus on the gap between the policy or procedure. A lot of times, safety training or quality training revolves around SOPs at an organization. Compliance training can be all sorts of things, and I think most organizations have to go through it. So, focusing on the gap between the policy or procedure and the actual action that people are taking. So you've had a chance to just kind of take a look and peruse some of these questions. And we even had somebody who said, I want to give a thumbs up or a heart to some of these questions because they're really good questions. So what I want to do now is come up to the ceremony of the 2026 Debriefing Awards. It is award season. And so why don't we kind of take a look at some of these questions, and I'm going to put you into small groups here. And when you're in small groups, I want you to kind of take a look through the myriad questions that are on this handout. And I want you to think through, which question would you award if you had to take a look at all these questions, or maybe in your small group, some people are going to be talking about, oh, this is a question that I use when I debrief. What question would you nominate for most likely to use in your next training? And then a second question, or a second award nomination is most likely to give learners a massive aha moment, right? So we want to, one of these questions comes from the perspective of you as a trainer or a facilitator, which is the question that you would be most likely to use in your next training. The other is kind of from a participant-centered lens, most likely to give the learners a massive aha moment. Now, we're going to put a link Rachel's already put the link to the Debriefing Awards nomination ballot into the chat. And the way this is going to work is over on the left-hand side, you'll see that there are a bunch of tabs. So when you get put into a breakout room, you're going to find the tab for your specific breakout room. So make sure that you go to that tab first. And then that's where you can kind of discuss and figure out which questions are you going to nominate for most likely to use in your next training, most likely to give learners an aha moment. And then throughout the course of your conversation, you are going to just write in what your nomination might be. That said, if you have a question that doesn't appear on here, but somebody in your group is like, oh, I have this great question that I use, go ahead and put your own question in there as well. So Tim is here. He's going to put us into breakout rooms. For those that are not able to make it into a breakout room, sit tight and we'll have this conversation here in the general room in just a moment.
Yeah, so everyone, you'll be in a room between 1 and 10. So pick the tab breakout room 1 through 10. Look at your breakout room number once you enter the room. Brian, we have I think about 44 people have gotten into the document so far. So I think we're gonna launch it.
Great. And I see one question that says, are we selecting one question from each category? No. Just kind of take a look through the document. And if there's one question that stands out to you that you would be most likely to use, go ahead and put that in there. I know that different people are going to have different focuses of the trainings, but that'll be some of the debate in your small groups.
Okay, here we go.
All right. For the folks that are still here, I'm going to put up our own ballot for the general room here. I'm going to wait just a few more moments for people to go ahead and get into the breakout rooms. And then we'll start to have a little bit of a conversation here. All right. So, for the folks that are here, thank you for sticking around in the general room. We're going to jump in here. Oh, it looks like people have already started um, to give answers into the general room. I'm going to, let's see, the general room. Um, All right. Well, if you are in the general room right now, let's take a few moments just to take a look through. There's a lot of questions on this handout. So take a few moments to look through that. And if you have some thoughts or some questions, or if you have like a question that you think is really good, go ahead and put it into either the document here, or if you're blocked from using that Google document, go ahead and put it into the chat and we'll have some conversation around that. And for the folks that are in the general room right now, in the chat, um, I'm wondering if you take a look at some of these questions, if you think of your own experiences, I'm wondering, does anybody here in the general room have any questions uh, that you don't see on here that sometimes you've used, or do you see something on here that inspires you to come up with a question of your own? So if you have a different kind of question, if you could put that into the chat, I'm just kind of curious, what are some of the other questions that you're using when you're debriefing that didn't make it onto this list? And Jennifer saying, what was the most uncomfortable truth you had to face during the discussion? Jennifer, would you put that? I'm going to ask you to put it into the chat here. Would you put that into a question you're most likely to use, or would you think that that's something that is most likely to inspire an aha from your participants? Most likely to use. Okay, that makes sense. And Edmund has, if you could change one company policy based on what you learned today, what would it be? I think that's a fascinating question because we start to put some of the power into our learners' hands. Now, with that particular question, we'd also have to put some structure and some caveats around it. So if you could change one company policy based on what you learned today, what would it be? If the point of that is let's have a group meeting to revisit some of our organizational policies. Great. That question can really take on some legs. If the point of the question is to introduce people to some different policies and procedures, and we know that our company isn't going to change their policies, we need to make sure that we let people know about that as well, because we don't want people to feel, oh my gosh, great, we're empowered to change things, and then after the discussion, nothing changes, right? So sometimes we have to kind of put some caveats and some structure around some of the things we're doing as well. Amanda's saying, for general awareness, how would you explain what you learned today in a way a 5-year-old could understand? And I love that question because it really forces us to break things down, especially because a lot of times when if we're training people and we have some sort of subject matter expertise, it's really easy for us to forget what it was like to learn something for the first time. And so being able to, or sometimes we receive information as a learner and we're sitting there thinking, all right, I think I get it. Well, would you be able to, do you get it enough that you would be able to kind of put it into simpler terms that could be explained to a 5-year-old or somebody who's just a novice who needs to learn this thing that you just learned? There's a lot of questions being added to the general session room, and I wonder how many of these are people who are here in the general session, or how many of these are folks in breakout rooms that haven't turned to different tabs. But it's kind of fun to be able to see what other people are doing as well. That's also the joy. If you have access to this Google document, you will continue to have access to it, so you can see kind of what some of the other groups have put in there as well. I see
And
Tim.
Brian, I've gone through all 10 breakout rooms, and most of them had a lot of activity in them.
Okay.
So clearly there's good discussions going on. So I think, yeah, that may
Yeah.
be, but we have a lot of people in the general room as well.
Yep. Perfect. I'm just looking at some of the other questions that people are putting in there. This is a really interesting one. If a new hire watched you perform that task, what bad habit might they have accidentally picked up? And that is a great debriefing question. It's also a great anchor question. And so some of the questions that you're seeing on this worksheet that gives you this list of questions can be used at the very end. Sometimes, depending on the intent of your session or how you want to design it, it could actually be used in the beginning as well. And that certainly is one, especially if we're trying to eliminate and stamp out bad habits that people have come into the training session with. That said, if we're going to teach people a process, sometimes people need to make sure that they are doing the process by the letter of the law, by each step, before they take it into their own hands and start to customize it for their own uses. So that's a great question to ask as well. And I think it's a good aha moment because it puts it back onto the learners. Often I work with childcare providers who are being pulled in too many directions and often complete professional development to check a licensing box. So if it was a mandatory training, I would ask, what do you think would have been helpful to learn or talk about today? I love that, and I love that there's some thought and intent behind what is the learner's intent of being here, because whether it is the early learning profession, education in general, the legal profession, medical profession, there's a lot of professions that require continuing education and professional development, and a lot of people attend it just to check a box. And so that's another way that debriefing can help people find value when they didn't even realize that they're going to find value. Um, Tim, do you want to give us a 2-minute warning for our breakout rooms here? Thank you.
Yes, we can
Uh,
absolutely do that.
awesome. There is a good match between if a new hire watched you perform that task, what bad habit might they have accidentally picked up, and what is the cost of ignorance? What happens if we just ignore this awareness? The first leads into the aha moment. And there, yeah, some of these questions are really, really helpful just in terms of bringing the learning to the next level. I'm looking at some of the other things that people have highlighted in here. What is the most common mistake a novice user makes that a master avoids? which is a really interesting question depending on your audience. If you have an audience of novices who just learned a skill, the answer they might give might be different than somebody who is really experienced, but they're learning to go they're relearning skills or getting relicensed in skills or things like that. That's also a really helpful question to ask for a group that has a number of participants who have different experience levels. So some of these questions might not only be helpful for the content itself, but they could be helpful for the way that we have attendees come in from a variety of different experience levels as well. What was the most uncomfortable truth you had to face? That's one that we talked about. Let's see. Which person or department in this room do you realize you need to connect with more often outside of this training room to be successful? That's a really interesting question because that one goes into beyond kind of the content of the room, but training as a way for social learning to happen as well. Because a lot of times training itself and skills don't happen in isolation. So being able to make connections with the people who you're learning with, and that's part of the reason we do some of these breakout rooms as well. All right. I'm going to come up for air here for a second. I'm going to wait until we bring our participants back from their breakout rooms and their discussions, just talking about some of the questions, and we'll get started here again in another few seconds.
Brian, I've checked on every room and it looks like most of them did really well at submitting some nominations. So I think we're pretty close. Um, I was not timing it particularly from the 2 minute warning, so there will be many apologies if we cut people off, but I think it's probably close enough. We should get going. Correct?
Yeah, let's bring them back.
Okay.
All right, welcome back from the small group conversation. It looks like people were writing furiously into the document. And something that I explained during our conversation here in the general room, but I'll reiterate it for everybody, is that you have access to this link. And following this webinar, or maybe you're going to do it while I'm talking here, but it could just be really helpful and interesting because I know that we can't have 94 people talking all at the same time, which is why we had those small group conversations. But feel free to take a look at what some of the other groups came up with when they were nominating some of these questions as being really helpful or really important for them.
And
Tim?
one of the things that my colleague Rachel and I do after every webinar is look at resources like this and see where can we share something that's really valuable. So we've talked about this being the debrief awards. Well, we're not tabulating the results during the webinar, but we will come back with kind of based on the chat and what you put into the document. There will be a follow-up afterwards. So you'll see some of this as well as the actual the resource that you already have.
And I just want to come back. And group one is already taking on the challenge. And I see that Michelle Norton has her hand up. And I'm kind of curious if you want to. Well, actually, so I'm gonna toss out the question, and then I would love to take a few people off of mute and hear some of the conversation that you had in your small groups. Actually, I'm not going to be able to take you off of mute. I'm just taking a look at the time right now. We'll take one or two people off of mute. But what was your favorite debriefing question, which maybe it's the same as what you nominated, or maybe it's just something that you're like, oh, I don't know, this is kind of the thing that I would use at my next training or a big aha moment, but I really enjoyed, I really could see how I could use this question in a variety of settings or things like that. What was your favorite debrief question? And I see the group one already put something in there. There's a bunch of other thoughts that are coming in here as well. If somebody wants to raise their hand, if you had a really good conversation in your small group, I would love to hear just maybe one or two groups what it was that you kind of had a chance to discuss when you were taking a look through these questions. Tim, would you mind taking Aaron off of mute?
Yeah, we actually had somebody who works with students in a college setting, and they're working with them at a point of sort of crisis or a juncture of not being successful in a college setting. And so I really liked their chosen question, which was, what was a mistake you made at the beginning that could have prevented or that snowballed? So that opportunity to catch somebody, maybe even before you've ultimately lost them. I just thought that was a really interesting one from a group member. And then another person works with parents. And so that what can you do in the next 48 hours or what's something that, has changed your mental model so that you can action and operationalize and commit to doing something different behaviorally in the near term. So those were two great ones from our group members.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron. Good to see you here. And it looks like Angelina also looks like she has something to share. Are we able to take her off of mute, or is she able to unmute herself? There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yay. We had a really good group going, a lot of discussion. We were all from different backgrounds. So even though we had that in those cases, we were still able to pinpoint some that applied to all of us. So we said a really good one was, what have you learned about yourself that you're positively committed to improving? And is that possible, or are there systemic issues in the way? And then another one was, what truth shared gently could help us move towards a greater outcome?
And I'm sorry, were these questions that you pulled from the sheet, or were these questions that the group talked about, things that they sometimes ask in their own sessions?
This is one, let's see, Carolyn got that last one from another training that she just did. And then Heather uses that first question. She actually uses that in her training.
Yeah, I thank you so much for sharing those because that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get people in kind of having these conversations in small groups because sure, there's more than 50 questions on this handout, but other people have so many, and this is just a starting point. There are so many good questions, so many important questions to ask. One of the things that I've seen, and sometimes I've used it when I've gone into a training session not as prepared as I should be, is so what's your big takeaway from this? And that gets people thinking, but these particular questions are a little bit more focused and go a little bit beyond that initial surface level in order to get people thinking about the experience they just had, how it can impact them, what they might change, or what they might do going forward. So thank you so much for humoring us and getting into those breakout rooms once more. Now, the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to debriefing is the debrief itself. It's more than just asking questions. So at its core, the most fundamental, you have to have the right questions. But the other piece to a debrief is sometimes it requires a little bit more structure than let's have a conversation. So let me share a few ways that you're going to be able to structure your debrief, or you might think about structuring again based on the learning outcomes and the intent of your training session. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is simply what this is, right? So debriefing structure, this is a pretty simple one, just a verbal Q&A. So let's pick out some questions from this handout or some questions that we use, and let's have a conversation, and it could be in a small group and then a large group. The thing about this is anytime we have questions, especially debrief questions, we do need to give people time to process what they just experienced. So either give the debriefing questions out and let people think about it, or maybe you even give the debriefing questions out in advance of an activity to have people thinking about what they should be learning or thinking about, and then come back to those questions after the activity's over. Another way to give structure is just individual journaling. Now, this particular strategy has some pros and cons. So when it comes to pros, it challenges everyone in the learning experience to think about what they just did. Now, the con to this is that if you don't have report outs, then people may miss out on key takeaways or thoughts that some other people in the room had. So there's definitely some advantages and disadvantages to doing something that's individual, but it does challenge everybody to come up with their own key takeaways. Another kind of debriefing structure. Sometimes I'll use this structure after a teach back during a train the trainer session or after a role play or something like that, is pluses and deltas. And so this is simply it kind of the traditional pluses and deltas is simply to have a T chart that just says, okay, what went well and what would we change for next time? Now, there's some ways to go beyond that or to give that a little bit more intent and structure. So if you wanted to have some alternate questions to the pluses, it could be, things such as what did you do that you would want to make a habit? Or what decision did you make in the moment that you'd want to make again and why, right? So those are kind of pluses, but it gives us a little bit more direction. It gives the learners a little bit more direction to this because sometimes when we ask a general question like what worked well, we can get all sorts of answers, but these questions kind of help to steer the conversation. And also when it comes to the deltas, it's not just what would you change, but maybe when during that did something feel off, or what else would you need to be more successful, right? So those questions might help to give a little bit more structure to the pluses and deltas. Those are all simple ways to structure. Let me give you two more ways to structure your debrief session. And the one of them is an after action review. This is so the original concept of this comes from the U.S. military after they do some sort of training exercise. But I've seen it used also after a simulation, sometimes after a role play, things like that, in a training room as well. And so the after action review basically asks several questions. One is what was supposed to happen? So what was the plan going into that learning experience or that simulation? Then what actually happened? So what was the reality? Why was there a difference? And what will we do differently next time? So that gives us a little bit of structure in terms of how we're going to talk about the experience that we just had. And one final way, and there's lots of different ways to structure debriefing, but I wanted to kind of just give you a few samples of things that can go from simple to intermediate to complex. And the most complex one is represented by the acronym ORID, and this is developed by the Institute of Cultural Affairs. And the purpose of this, and this needs some practice. Probably there's whole trainings that you can go to that help people kind of navigate this particular process in order to facilitate it effectively. But basically, what this does is it slows down the feedback and has people break down their thoughts of the debrief into different components. So the first thing that we might do is focus on the O, which is objective observations. And so what facts did you see or hear or read? Another or the next step is, okay, so after the facts, right? So after the objective observations, let's get a little reflective now. What's your gut reaction? How did it feel? Was there some tension someplace in here? What was happening? So that's kind of more of the subjective observations, and then we figure out, okay, well, how do we interpret this? So what was the meaning of the outcome to that experience that we just had? What was the key takeaway? Why did this happen? And then finally, the D is the decisional. What's the next step or action plan? Now, there's lots of different structures The simple stuff can be done just using some questions. The more complex strategies and structures need some practice, maybe even some training in how you actually do that. But that all leads us back to the question of how should we debrief? I asked this question at the very beginning of this webinar. We've talked about some different buckets for the training intent. We've talked about questions that go beyond surface level questions. We've talked about some different ways to structure your debriefing. So, when might we use each of these different structures? And I know that we're running a little short on time here, and we have some wrap up announcements that we want to make. But I'm just going to real quick walk you through the very bottom of that handout that has all of the questions. I guess it's the very last page of that handout has all the questions. Also has a table that looks like this. And I was gonna just kind of do a quick polling activity to end here, but I'm not gonna do that. We're just going to, this will be something that as you think about the different strategies and the different intents for training, there's some different ways to do it, but there's also some things that might not be so appropriate. And so if I was doing a training that was just focused on general awareness, the only strategies that I might use would be either verbal Q&A or individual journaling. I'm going to leave you all to kind of thinking through, if I do a technical training or if I do leadership development or if I do a training on safety, quality, and compliance, or, kind of insert your own training intent in here. What would be some of the strategies I might want to use? What would be a little bit too much? And what's not enough, right? So, which strategies might we want to use? The last thought I'm going to leave you with before we wrap up today, or as we wrap up today, is when it comes to the training activity debrief, it goes back to part of it's art, part of it's science, but learning by thinking is better than learning by doing. Learning by doing is good. Don't get me wrong. Don't go back to some people and say, Brian says we shouldn't do learning by doing, because I do want you to learn by doing. That said, I want some of the key takeaways to be learning from thinking that happens after the doing. Thank you so much for sticking around for today's webinar. Just a reminder that if you would like to join us next month, we're going to be talking about scenario-based instructor-led training. This is a little bit of inspiration from last month's webinar around how to engage with challenging participants. We did some choose your own adventure stuff. Oftentimes people think of branching scenarios in e-learning, but we're going to here talk about next month, we're going to talk about using branching scenarios in instructor-led training and also kind of what's the difference between that and role play. So please join us next month and we'll do another free webinar. One thing that we would love for you to do is to connect with us on LinkedIn. And so you can go ahead and scan that QR code if you'd like to follow Endurance Learning at the very end. The last slide I have, I will put the QR code back up to my own LinkedIn profile as well. Tim mentioned at the very beginning of this is that we do offer more expanded versions of these webinars for organizations that are like, hey, can you do this for our organization? So if you'd like to connect with us, please do send us a note either through LinkedIn or email, and we'd love to work with your organization and do some of this stuff a little bit in a little bit more expanded way. That said, thank you so much for being here today, and we'll see you next month. If you would like to,